I came across this description of a toddler in a novel that I'm reading at the moment. Richard was all boy, early to walk and late to talk. It's a work of fiction, but it's a view of boys that I've regularly come across as the mother of a son. When he was younger and we were on the play session circuit together, I was forever being told, what with him being a boy, that you've got your hands full there. Often as he sat placidly stacking cups or doing something else entirely self-contained and harmless. And other times, if he did something like half-heartedly grab for a toy, somebody would pipe up, "That's boys for you." I think from the media to merchandise to our own lazy assumptions, boys are framed from babies as rowdy, naughty, physical, unthinking, more interested in tearing around rather than talking, making noise rather than nurturing, and competing rather than cooperating. Here comes trouble. I think we flatter ourselves that we live in a relatively socially progressive and unbuttoned age, but in researching my book, I was taken aback by how mindful boys and men are of the notion of a real man as emotionally and physically strong and domineering, whether they felt that they lived up to that ideal or not. In recent years, there's been growing concern about the stereotyping of girls, and rightly so. But I think we also need to examine just as critically the stereotyping of boys and what that means for their upbringing, for their notions of what it is to be a man, and for the people they live with and among. Through my research, I was horrified to realise the extent to which parents, including myself, treat boys and girls differently, often in quite nuanced ways that nonetheless have a very powerful effect. So to take some examples, parents tend to assume that boys are more physically adept than girls. They punish them more harshly. They talk to them less than to their daughters. And they're certainly less likely to discuss emotions with boys, with the exception of anger, which they talk to boys about more than girls. They're also less likely to read to boys or to take them to the library. Boys, why would they be interested in books, or gentleness, or contemplation, or conversation? That's not for little toughies. As a feminist, I firmly believe that gender, the roles and expectations imposed on males and females according to their sex, is a means of patriarchal oppression, and that men generally hold the cards when it comes to money and power. But I think we also need to acknowledge that gender oppresses boys and men, as well as girls and women. And I think we need to consider more carefully than we have done joining the dots between the framing of masculinity as powerful, tough, stoic, and, for instance, boys' behavioural problems in school, the male-dominated prison population, the cultural, legislative and internal barriers that men face in becoming fully involved fathers to their children, and the rates of suicide among men. As one of my interviewees who knew a number of people who committed suicide put it to me, talking isn't being a geezer, is it? If we take the experience of some boys in school, and I say some because obviously class and ethnicity comes into it as into so much else, boys are 3 times more likely to be temporarily excluded from school than girls. And as the sociologist Anne Oakley has pointed out, the exclusion of mainly males from school is the start of the gendering of indiscipline, with over 60% of the prison population having been temporarily excluded from school. JV, a young man I met, described his own experience of this trajectory from educational rejection to criminality. His school wouldn't let him stay on after his GCSEs because of his patchy attendance record. He said to me, "They said I was a bad example, and that really upset me. That whole image about being the young black man, everyone against you, life is hard. For the first time I felt it. I was really angry by then, and I'm getting arrested, getting stabbed, being a young man, so to speak, if you're from where I'm from. Looking back on it now, it sounds nuts, but I can explain it in one word: thrill. The thrill of getting into fights, street stuff, gang stuff. I'm going to be honest with you. Being known for being a bad boy is an amazing feeling. You are the man." So there we have notions of masculinity as detrimental on men as vividly set out by JV, but it's also important to remember that they can also have a detrimental effect on girls and women. Because if being a man is about being powerful, often that power is exercised over the opposite sex, through sexual harassment at school or on campus, everyday sexism on the street, or physical violence. Whether it's in relation to lad culture, gang violence, or suicide rates, there's lots of talk about a crisis of masculinity. And I find this tag is unhelpful because it conjures up ideas of an agony-racked mass of men. And we know that the truth is more complex than that. Besides, I don't think it's a crisis of masculinity. I think the crisis is masculinity. And I think that rather than wasting our time trying to tinker with a broken model, let's get rid of notions of masculinity and femininity altogether. I don't want a multitude of genders or fluidity of gender. I want a world beyond gender, where men and women are people with individual characteristics, aptitudes, interests, strengths, and weaknesses, free of expectations based on our sex. So how would we achieve this post-gender state? I think parents need to be more mindful of the gendered assumptions in their interactions with their children and resist going with the pink and blue flow or allowing anxiety about their child fitting in to override the need to instill in children confidence in them to be themselves as individual, complex people. And we need to talk to children about the gendered peer pressure that they will come across and how to negotiate it effectively and pragmatically. Even hearing that gender is a construct can be a revelation to children. I remember talking to a young person who described it as their Narnia moment, a new world opened up to them. And parents, of course, can also show by example. Dads who equally share the care of their children demonstrate that men can nurture, and it also opens up their own emotional life. Fatherhood has given me an opportunity to be a different me, one dad told me. These men act as pioneers in the workplace, and I think others are more likely to take parental leave or work flexibly if they see these dads successfully do so themselves. And in many ways, I think active fatherhood is a route through to many virtuous circles. We need even broader and more sweeping changes too. I'm sure most of you are fully acquainted with the work of Bell Hooks and her incisive, compassionate writing on boys and men. As for me, I've always got time for somebody who rails so uncompromisingly against imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. She sees very clearly that the well-being of men and women is intricately bound up together. And she also sees that what boys need is love. Rather than assuming that they're little toughies, they should be nurtured as young people who want to be loved and are capable of giving love in return. This is the love ethic of which she writes so movingly. So we need to treat our boys with greater compassion, understanding, and love. And of course, we also need to smash the patriarchy. As Bell Hooks wrote in The Will to Change, in patriarchal culture, males are not allowed to simply be who they are. Their value is always determined by what they do. In an anti-patriarchal culture, males do not have to prove their worth and value. They know that simply being gives them value, the right to be cherished and loved. I believe that in trying to prove their value and worth, that so much damage is done by men, and even boys, damage to themselves and to others. So men need to take up Bell Hooks' call to the will to change. And one of the most heartening aspects of the research I did was to meet many boys and men of all ages and from varied walks of life who've come round to this way of thinking and are spreading the word, even if they don't express it in those terms. Because men need feminism, and feminism needs men. When we're looking to defeat patriarchy, it helps to have some people doing an inside job. It's great to see high-profile figures such as the completely admirable Grayson Perry putting the masculinity debate centre stage. And now the task is to maintain momentum and to take the debate beyond the world of prize-winning transvestite ceramicists with a series on Channel 4. So let's come together, men and women, to overthrow patriarchy and to liberate ourselves so that we're all free to be who we want to be.
Patrick, you've got the unlucky task of having to follow up. It would be really useful, I think, to pick up on some of your research and knowledge in the kind of area of sort of early childhood and early development. It seems like a key sort of recurring theme here. So I wonder if that's something that we could pick up on and just your insight into that and any areas of research that might be particularly interesting right now or contentious that we might kind of pick up on.
So much of what I want to say resonates with what Rebecca's just said. So I won't go back over that ground again, but it is fundamentally, I think, true that this is about rules. About social rules and stereotypes and how we engage with them, because we've heard some frightening statistics about the damage that contemporary notions of masculinity can do for society and for men themselves, but you must remember that gender inequality pervades society and men still dominate in many, many different domains. The problems that men and boys are experiencing are perhaps only something that's become recognised recently as problematic. Perhaps men and boys have suffered for many years with some very difficult and very narrow stereotypes about what it is to be a man or to be a boy. The sort of social change that we need to move beyond that is something that's going to take a great deal of time and some very subtle changes in society, in policy and in attitudes. It's an incredibly important and timely topic, I think. I've done a few sort of gigs talking about gender and psychology. It's my area of research. And I have to say it's very refreshing to see so many men in the audience. Even talks about masculinity seem to attract very few men, so it's good to see that we have a lot of men here today. And as I said, gender pervades and gender stereotypes pervade our society, but it's certainly true that those become inculcated from a very young age. Even prior to birth, parents will decorate a baby's nursery in pink or blue, those insidious colours of femininity and masculinity. One of the first questions is almost always, is this a boy or a girl? That's not surprising. This is a ubiquitous binary distinction, and psychologically we know that we're very keen to find out about who we are, what our identity is. And from a social and societal perspective, gender is an important source of information. As I said, I think the key issue is how we engage with those stereotypes as we grow and develop as boys and then as men. And parental influence is certainly important. Media influence is also particularly powerful in terms of shaping those expectations. But it's worth, I think, revisiting some of the research on gender stereotypes about toy choice. The trucks for boys, the dolls for girl rule seems to apply ubiquitously for most parents, and the instances where parents discourage that are seen as exotic or unusual in some way. Parents, of course, are disapproving, well, not of course, the research shows that most parents are disapproving when a child picks a toy which transgresses those gender stereotypes, when a boy picks a doll or a girl picks a truck to play with. But they're far more disapproving when a boy chooses a doll than when a girl chooses a truck. Now that says something, I think, very specific about the power of male stereotypes to compel boys to conform to them. The other point I'd like to make from that body of research from the 70s and 80s into children's toy choice is that whilst parents were very disapproving of those transgender toy choices, by far and away the greatest disapproval comes from a child's peers, whether it's a boy or a girl. So from this very young age, children are already reproducing those stereotypes that they've picked up from parents and from society. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to battle against those. Say a little bit about academic approaches to masculinity. I think from my own discipline, psychology, we've been woefully poor at addressing masculinity and the problems that that causes. There's some good work on suicide, some problems that are specific to men's mental health, but perhaps we haven't got down and dirty with the fundamental problem here, which is around male identity, masculine stereotypes. And I think there's a lot of work that my discipline has to do. There's certainly a publication bias in finding gender differences when, more often than not, the genders are remarkably similar. We tend to look for difference, but more often than not, there is no gender difference there, from things like some sort of instinctive implicit mathematical ability, even through to some of the work on spatial rotation tasks, which is often seen as the bastion for innate sex differences in psychological functioning. So there needs to be a change in attitudes towards gender in terms of media, in terms of public attitudes, but also in terms of how academics approach publications and what counts as an interesting finding here. Some other things that I want to pick up. Male friendship is a really significant issue, I think, and the problems that men have in terms of friendships and developing friendships, and of course emotional literacy within those as well. Stereotypes, gender stereotypes are bad for men and for women. They do damage, and we need to find a new way of understanding identities and how we feel pressured to conform to those stereotypes. It's a slow task. It's one that involves making policy that will lead to genuine social and attitude change.
Jane, through Calm, you've worked a lot at a kind of grassroots level, going into pubs, bars, working with men where they're at. I'm interested to know a bit about your work over the last 20 years with Calm, but also about some of the sort of the social challenges that you've encountered at that grassroots level, and picking up on some of the things that we kind of said earlier on about the scale of the problem that affecting men, but whether it's about their kind of emotional lives, their psychological lives, but also particularly when it comes to suicide.
What I find interesting is that when I launched Calm, I would try and get the attention of the media to say it's the single biggest killer of men under the age of 35. And they'd say they'd be quite shocked, and then they'd kind of go, well, really like to do a story about this is terrible. Didn't realise this at all. And then they go back and they'd obviously have a conversation with the medical correspondent who'd say, yes, has she got anything new? So they'd come back and they'd say, have you got anything new? No. And so there was those kinds of conversations I'd have with the media. And then the other kind of conversation was, she's a mad old bat and she's completely got the figures wrong. And it took a long time to try and get the issue recognised and printed in the papers. Around the time of Bridgend, we would try and point out that most of the suicides within Bridgend, 75% were male, and there's blank. And the media would talk about young suicide. And after a lot of work, kind of going, actually, middle-aged, it's a huge issue with middle-aged men. The media now go, it's middle-aged men. And then this morning they've gone, and it's young people. It's 76% of all suicides are male. And the rates and the numbers haven't changed very much. The reason I'm rambling on about this is that there is discomfort from the journalists upwards and from everyone to say it's mainly men. Massive discomfort. It is much easier to either pick out a group of middle-aged men who clearly have got no friends, going through divorce, getting drunk too much, easier to talk about them, or young people, or prisoners. There is massive discomfort in talking about the needs of men and boys, and that's endemic within all of our structures. We launched, I think, 2014 as Year of the Male in a brave attempt to try and talk about the needs of men and boys talked about, and to ask institutions about what they were doing and how they were thinking about the needs of men and boys. And so the response was an overwhelming, deafening nothingness. And I remember some young, quite loud, kind of radical, individual, feminist guy saying, I want to get this off the ground, and he said it's too political. So I think what's interesting for me is the forces against this are, on the one hand, the kind of the institutions which says that you can talk about the needs of women ad nauseum. Look at any kind of gender equalities, policies, list, whatever. Lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff about girls and women. Nothing about boys or men, to the point where it is comic. It is institutional. Also, I think that there is immense discomfort by men to talk about the needs of men and boys, because to do so would be not to be a proper man, and this is the crux of it. If you're going to be a man, then you have to be in control. You are the strong one. You are the chosen one. You are the person responsible for everyone around you. How can you therefore say you need help? You are vulnerable. And so what we have is we've got people within positions of power kind of making a joke about male suicide. Because we just, we drink too much, we're a bit daft. We take sudden impulsive gestures. Single biggest killer of men under the age of 45. Single biggest killer. More men die from their own hands than die in car accidents, leaving a toxic bomb blast after every suicide. And yet we don't treat it as a public health issue, because to do so would mean we need to think about the needs of men and boys. And we can't, because if they need help, then by definition, they're not proper men, because men have got to be strong. And I think then finally we've got real fear about feminists, so they're going to kill us if we talk about this issue. Embarrassment by men about talking about the issue. And, still a kind of a bunch of men and women out there, for whom the identity, I am pretty and I'm feeble and I'm empty-headed, that's my definition. And a bunch of guys feeling that they should hang on to that. Those are the issues we face if we're going to change this. But my experience, to come back to your question, is that we are overwhelmed on a daily basis by guys getting in contact saying that this is not what they want. And the excitement, the huge excitement, and the passion and the creativity and all the stuff they do and see and write about for Calm is overwhelming and brilliant and really very, very exciting, and is pretty much the reason that I've continued to run Calm, is because it is so exciting. It's exciting because it is about change, and it's about changing the way that men are expected to be. And so all of the kind of the strong brand and the messaging and the writing and the website that you see from Calm is all from guys. And there is a real ongoing and absolute overwhelming message from them that they want to see change. And that for me is brilliant.